Okay, and that is our cue to begin. So welcome, good afternoon, and welcome to the Scottish Parliament. My name is Carol Mockin. I am one of the MSPs and I'm a member of the Health, Social Care and Sports Committee. And it's really great to see everybody here for the Festival of Politics and of course to our exciting discussion around social care. It's so lovely to see the Parliament really busy during recess, and I know a lot of the things that have been on have been very successful. So we are delighted to have join us for our panel, Do We Value Social Care? We have today Dr Donald McCaskill, who is the CEO of Scottish Care, the representative body of care providers in the independent sector in Scotland. And Dr McCaskill has worked in health and social care sectors across the UK for many years and has, you don't need to reveal how many, and has a professional focus on issues relating to bereavement, palliative care and individual human rights. And he sits on several government committees and working groups, and it's really a great delight to have you here today. Professor Anne Hendry leads the International Centre for Integrated Care, is an honorary professor at the University of the West of Scotland and a trustee of Compassionate Inverclyde and chair of Kilbride Hospice. She was National Clinical Lead for Reshaping Care for Older People in Scotland and has influenced international policy and practice on care for older people. And we have just at the end there, Emma Congreve. She is Principal Knowledge Exchange Fellow, sorry I got a bit tripped up there, and Deputy Director of the Fraser of Allen Institute. Emma's work at the Institute is focused on policy analysis. Many of us will have seen you, I'm sure, on our televisions, covering a wide range of areas of social and economic policy. And she is also co-lead of the Scottish Health Equality Research Unit. So it's a great delight to have everybody here today. I hope we can welcome them in the usual way, please, if you don't mind. So there will be, really, we discussed before we came on that it's really important to us that this is a flow and is a discussion because we're delighted to be here, but really, really delighted to have people here to engage in conversation and make sure that we can move things forward as we discuss it. So there's going to be every opportunity from the beginning for people to ask questions, but I thought it might be nice if I started with a kind of more general question, asked each of the panellists their view, and then we can open it out to the wider discussion. Does that sound okay with people? So the privilege of the chair, I guess it is, isn't it? So how would each of you describe the state of social care provision in Scotland and in the UK now in 2025? Well, I'll start with Emma. Would that be okay?
Of course, yeah. So I am going to say the obvious in that the state of provision is not where it needs to be. But I would qualify that slightly by saying actually we don't know to what extent we are behind where we need to be. And this is one of the core things that we have looked at when we've been considering social care, particularly in Scotland with the National Care Service Bill, that actually not only, the broader question for today is, do we value social care? Actually, that is really shown when you try and understand from policymakers, from civil servants. You ask the question, well, how many people need social care? And actually, we don't have the answer to that. So we struggle to even know the answer to how many people need care as it's currently offered. So if you think about the way the current eligibility criteria for care, we struggle to know, how many people need and get what they need under that. But then we have very little idea of what the scale of unmet need is. And that is really crucial. And I think this is the same for Scotland and for the whole of the UK, that it's kind of buried our head in the sand a little bit and not actually owned up to the fact that what care is supposed to be about. and it's supposed to be a service that meets the needs of people. And it seems to be a bit of, okay, well, we'll set some eligibility criteria and we'll just not worry about the people who don't fit into that. And what we've seen over the past 15 years, particularly the decade starting in the 2010s, a narrowing of the eligibility to be able to access care from the state. So actually, in some respects, we haven't seen a big rise in spend or demand for social care, but that's partly because we've trimmed down what we as a society, we as governments across Scotland and the UK will offer. So, yeah, for me, as an analyst, and that's my background, you want to understand, if you're going to think about a provision of a service that meets the needs of people, you need to know what that need is. And and no one seems to be really grappling with that question. So I'm going to start with we don't really know. So that's my perspective coming from someone who is trying to think about framing this in terms of what is required, and ultimately what we then try to think about is what resources are required to do that. And we're so far away from knowing the answer to that question at the moment.
Well, thank you for that. And posing another question, I suppose, but it's really, really helpful. Anne, do you have things that you could add in on this?
I would say it's extremely fragile as a state. There's absolutely no resilience left in social care. To use a health analogy, it's on life support, really. And it's the same across the UK. This is not just an issue in Scotland, and I do quite a lot of work collaborating with colleagues across Europe and beyond, and it's a global challenge that we have not given the investment and the priority to social care that we need, given the demography that we're facing, given the rising older people population, which is a huge success, a great success story that people are living longer, but they are living longer with multiple health conditions, and so as a result will need health care and social care to a greater extent. And despite the fact that we've seen that coming for very many years and done some element of planning, we still haven't really grasped that wicked challenge of how do we value social care, and we don't value it equitably with healthcare, and we certainly don't invest in it equitably with healthcare. So I would say it's extremely fragile, and it absolutely needs urgent attention. And we need to, I think, as Emma was saying, absolutely approach this challenge with good data and good understanding. For a start, what do we mean by social care? As an unpaid carer for my father, I was providing social care, but that was never really, we kind of jumped to services when we're focusing on some of the policy around this area, when the vast majority of social care in this country is provided by unpaid carers and by volunteers, by social network. Carol said I support Compassionate Inverclyde, which is a social movement, a charity of ordinary people who help ordinary people. That's social care, as well as voluntary organisations, as well as independent providers that Donald will talk about. So there's a very wide continuum of social care, and I think we need to be clear about what we're talking about.
No, very, very helpful, but that bridge that we need to think about. So, and Donald, would you come in on this as well?
And it's nice to be here, and hello to everybody. I'll get the answer to the question out of the way by saying that the state is, choose your alliteration, dreadful, disgraceful and dishonest. That's the state of social care in Scotland now. And I would start from where Anne finished, and that is, I think we need to understand what social care is. and it isn't usually what the media presents social care as or our political understanding of social care. And I am enough of an anorak to go all the way back to a unique piece of Scottish legislation in the late 1960s, which was the Scottish Social Work Scotland Act. And it described for the first time an understanding of social care which wasn't the state looking after you in a paternalistic way, an inheritor of the old poor law, where you ought to be grateful that the state is looking after you. And that was the attitude philosophically and politically up until the late 1960s, where in Scotland we said, no, we want a much more communitarian understanding of social care. We see it as our responsibility as a society to enable people not just to be healthy and maintained in their house or in a homely setting, but to use the language of Public Health Scotland at the moment, to flourish and thrive, to be citizens in their community, to play as full a part as anybody of their neighbours. And so from that moment, we did not describe social care as services and supports and models. We talked about housing being social care. We talked about community education being an element of social care. And gradually since that time, and not least since the 1980s, we've limited social care in our understanding to essentially maintaining people in their own homes, independently, ideally, for as long as possible. But that, you know, when I speak to people, and I'm sure all of us on the panel are the same, who use social care, it's not just about being kept alive, it's having a purpose for that life, having a sense of belonging to your community, having ambitions and dreams. And, you know, it was mentioned, I have done over time a lot of palliative work. I have met people literally with moments of their lives left, over 100, who still have dreams, aspirations, hopes and conversations which they need to have. And at the moment, first of all, we need to, I think, gain a wider societal understanding of what social care is. And secondly, we need to challenge the presumption at the moment, which is politically and fiscally present, which is social care is there to alleviate the pressures on the NHS. Now, if we work and embed social care well, then it goes part of that way. It contributes, but it's not its essence. It's not what it's there to do, and it's not what people receiving social care support require. And we will no doubt go on to talk in more detail about why we're in the state that we're in. But I used those earlier descriptions because, not least because I landed in the front page of the Herald yesterday, somewhat critical of the current state in Scotland over the summer. But as Anne said, right across the UK, there is a failure to grasp what we need to do for social care and what we need to do for social care on its own, in its entirety, and not just because what might or might not be happening to the NHS.
Thank you. I mean, excellent opening remarks and real things for people to think about. Now, what I would like to try and do is bring some people in at this stage if they can, and if you're happy to, it'd be really, I think, helpful for us to understand if you have a background in social care or if you're here just to hear the remarks of the panellists. But if you have some experience and you're happy to share that, I'm sure we would love to hear it. So is there anybody who would like to come in at this stage with a question, either for all the panel or for particularly from the remarks that we've just heard? Got any takers? Yeah, we've got a little mic, so if you just give us a second.
Thank you. I'll start with an observation and then a question. It's interesting, the question is, do we value social care? Here we are on a Friday afternoon, quite late on in the day. This is the third last session in the Festival of Politics. I've been to a number of sessions. This is by far the smallest audience. I suspect the answer almost lies in the way this is situated in the programme. But I'm interested in what the speakers have said about social care and the use of that expression and its origin. And I, for one, certainly don't think I fully understand what social care is about and haven't, until quite recently, been sufficiently interested. Do you think that there needs to be a reframing, and might another expression be found rather than social care, which is vague perhaps and unclear to so many folk? So if you had the opportunity, how might you reframe the expression, the words that describe what it is that this session is about, rather than social care.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful, and can also say we also mentioned that this, is perhaps not the highest level of time and date for this session as well. So your point is very well made, but we'll go on obviously to discuss the question. I don't know, Anne, you're nodding. Do you want to come in on this?
It's a great question, actually, and one of my areas of interest is very much the sort of integration of healthcare and social care and housing. And increasingly, the more you unpeel that onion, it's all of the levers that mostly sit with local government that help you to live a good life. So this is why I struggle with the philosophy or the policy that has healthcare over here, social care over here, housing over there, lifelong learning, education, transport, employment, all of the things that we need to help us be well. And if you look at the wider definition of health, it is the state of physical, emotional, psychological well-being. And therefore, why would you separate healthcare and social care? And I think the journey that we've been on in Scotland over the last decade or so, and I personally have sat in this room with, justifying to the Health and Sport Committee why we're trying to integrate health and social care. I think it's the right journey. I think the last 3 years with the National Care Service Bill have threatened to dismantle all of the work over the last decade. I think we've been paralysed in Scotland over this National Care Service. And now, thankfully, we're getting to a point where we can draw breath and actually look at the reform that is going to take us further to the outcomes that we need. How do we create the conditions for people to live a better life? And how do we do that in a way that is inclusive and narrows the gap in terms of health inequalities? Because we know that the people who most need joined up care, whether it's healthcare or social care, are the people who are hardly reached or are more marginalised individuals or communities.
Yeah, and I don't know, Donald, would you have a name?
With Anne, I've long been a campaigner for integrating our health and social care systems. And, if you're using supports, you don't really care, and we talked about this, in fact, we talked about it just before we came, you don't really care what's the colour of the uniform that somebody's wearing. What you don't want to do and what you have to do is retell your story 20, 30 times in the pathway of moving from social care assessment all the way possibly to acute and secondary care. So we need to, and I hope the energy that we're beginning to find post the last 3 years is to return towards a much more whole one system, integrated approach. 2 quick observations. One is I'm passionate about the social care word. And the reason is social is there deliberately because it has that communitarian understanding. It's about being a citizen in your local community, having a sense of belonging, and that part of what enables us to live well, to be healthy in the definition that Anne gave, is our relationships with other people. And that social dimension and maintaining that is all the more important. At the moment, what we're seeing, because of budget cuts, is that packages of care in people's own homes are being reduced to 15 minutes. How can you form a relationship with the person supporting you? How can you enable an interaction which is in any sense dignified in a 15-minute visit? So that social dimension, that relationship is, I think, critical. So I would hold on to social care and support, because the word care for many people is very transactional and one way, me caring for you, whereas support is a mutual thing. The second observation I would make is that we have to be honest, dare I say, in these hallowed halls. The current spend on health on the NHS is £18 billion. The spend on social care is £4.4 billion. And despite the rhetoric of transferring the balance of care from acute, secondary care and support to community, primary and social care, there has hardly been anything but a trickle from that direction to here into social care. So if we're serious about social care and there is a limited amount of resource available, we're going to have to make some hard decisions about how much we spend on the NHS over here compared to social care over there. Or we increase the volume of spend in social care deliberately and don't do the same for the NHS.
Yeah. I'm going to come to you, Emma, but I wonder, I know obviously your background and the thoughts you put into these things, you know, what Helen and, Anne and Donald have spoken about. I'm wondering, do you think politicians don't know this or they don't react to this?
That's a good question. So just one observation before. The other thing I want to raise, we do a lot of work with adults with learning disabilities, and I think that's one key group that often get forgotten when we talk about social care. And social care and support is the right thing for them, because actually it's support to live. Like, you know, most people with learning disabilities can lead, you know, reasonably independent lives with the right support. It's not care doesn't quite fit with what they need. In most cases, for mild and moderate. So I think it's really important that that we remind people when we say the word social care, it's not just older people, it's also working age people. And actually we use social care for children's services as well. So it probably needs a bit of a qualification or explanation when we're using the term as to that it's not just one part of the population. It's it covers a broad brush. But I mean, I think from my experience of working, I probably only worked on areas around social care probably for the past 5 years or so. So I'm relatively new to working in this area. It's been a huge learning curve for me. And there's been a lot of things that I didn't know until I engaged with it. So, and I think politicians are probably, you know, got that vague awareness, know there's a problem, but actually to really get to grips with it, you have to spend a lot of time, and you have to really want to as well. So, and I don't think it's a particularly, dare I say, it's sexy subject for politicians, because it's so difficult. And I think you find people really passionate when they have, you know, come into contact with the system. That's where you see people, you know, becoming passionate advocates of things need to change. But for parts of the population that are fortunate enough to not have had that, it does probably feel like an issue that sits over here somewhere. And I think that's probably the same for politicians, who are just normal people as well. And I think because it's got this reputation as a sort of a wicked problem, that actually to engage with it might feel quite risky for some politicians as well, because there isn't really, you know, there's not a win-win solution here. There's trade-offs, there's difficulties, and potentially you may not feel that the public is wholly behind you, because they might not really understand, you know, especially when it's being pitted against health as a budget area. So I do have sympathy with politicians. Saying that's the absolute bin fire that's been the National Care Service over the past few years. I think politicians and civil servants should have been doing a much better job. You know, it was their job. This was a bill, and there were so many holes in it, and that's just not acceptable. So I think for people whose job it was over the past 3 or 4 years in Scotland, there's a lot
There's a lot to learn.
Lot to learn, yeah.
Happen, Jen. You have all mentioned it really as a wicked problem, that sort of problem that there's no win-win solution. Donald, do you think there's something that politicians need to take from that? You know, like how do we engage people to make that move that you were talking about in terms of funding, that big bulk of funding to health, who we all agree, you know, people must have their health care. What is it that we say to politicians to talk about either investing more or transferring some? How do we address that?
I mean, I'm on record as saying that I think we'll never get the wicked problem answered or even begin the answer if we keep using social care as a political football. So I really do, and it's difficult saying this in this environment, I really do feel the time has come for us to learn from other countries like Sweden. Australia is a really good example, where they accepted that there were real challenges. One being, we've got a demographic challenge, and like Anne, it's fantastic that we're living longer. I hope statistically to be one of those who lives beyond my life expectancy. How are we going to support older people in particular, though social care is for everybody, as we've got fewer and fewer people of working age contributing to a tax base which traditionally we've used to pay for the services and supports that we have. So fundamentally, and moving towards the to the election of May the 8th, I would like to see, and I'm not naive in saying that this is going to happen, but hopefully after the election, that there will be an attempt to come together cross-party to do some serious work on asking these difficult questions. How are we going to reform the system so that it's not as competitive as it is at the moment? How are we going to rebalance the amount of money that we allocate to health and social care so more goes into social care? Because if social care helps to keep people out of hospital and more independent for longer, then it's not rocket science to work out that is going to save the NHS, to say nothing of how beneficial it's going to be to the individual. How are we going to award and reward and recognise a workforce? Take, for example, if you're a New Start carer in social care, you're moving into a professional, regulated, registered profession. If you do the same in the health sector, you don't have to be regulated and registered to the same extent, but you will get paid £3 an hour more for doing virtually the same activities. So there's a great imbalance in the system. All those wicked problems have one overarching one, which is how are we going to pay for it? Because I think personally, we need to look at the fact that no tax system as it currently exists in the UK will pay for the quality of care and support in either the NHS or in social care. And we need to look at continental approaches to insurance models. And I'm not talking about privatisation, quite the reverse. We need to start recognising we've got a way with not paying for care if we're moving into the future where all of us are going to have to start paying for care.
Okay. That's an interesting point, and one I'm sure that politicians and political parties will have different views on. I wonder if anyone in the audience wants to come back on that. Is there anybody who would have a view on any of the things that we've discussed here? Yeah, I'm going to take this lady in the green, and then I'll come to you at the back.
Thank you. Hello. I'm an ex-social worker in health settings in England, so I don't necessarily know completely the situation up here, but I just want to sort of, in a way, mention another end of the kind of social care spectrum that we've been talking about. I'm not completely comfortable with the phrase social care anymore, because it seems to me down our end that we've got more and more people being looked after at home who are more sort of chronic health needs people, and they may well not be all that old, but I'm talking about people at home who are managing with, ceiling hoists and every bodily function being catered for, including possibly respiration machines, etc., etc. And I mean, the Care Quality Commission and the nursing homes. They seem to have categories of care home or nursing home, and I feel almost that we need a third category for people who need more care that at one time you would have had in longer stay NHS beds. So I'm a bit worried about us just saying social care or health care, because there are a lot of people at home who need a lot of health care.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a very good point. I don't know, Anne, you might want to come in on this.
I would absolutely agree with you. And although I practiced as a geriatrician in Scotland, but I'm also have done a lot of work with the British Geriatric Society UK-wide. So I'm familiar with what you're describing around the application of continuing health care criteria. And that boils down to, who's paying for this service? And you're absolutely right. You know, we used to talk way back in the dark ages when I was training about, is it a medical bath or a social bath? You know, we've really not moved on that much in our thinking when you look at, you know, trying to fit the person in a service box or a funding box. What we really need to do is take a much more personalised and holistic approach. What does the person need to support them to stay well and to participate in the local social network, or to do what matters to them? And then who in our place, our neighbourhood, community, is best placed to deliver that? And if you take a much more place-based approach to commissioning, and a personalised and place-based approach, takes you to a very different place. The funding that Emma and Donald are far better tuned into than I am, the funding is mind-boggling. But when you've got such wicked problems like that, I think the best way to approach them is simplify it, bring it right down. What does this mean for my town, my village? I'm doing some work in an area in Wales where they don't have a district general hospital. And so they're planning their health and care services together, and they're looking at it, because it's a very rural, dispersed area, they're looking at it community by community. I think that's the way through this. We've got stuck for years at this national level where health budget, social care budget, and nobody budging on their budgets. Let's take it down a level, because the funding is workforce funding, whether that's healthcare employed, local government employed, independent provider, third sector provider, or funding for, you know, maybe direct payments for a personal carer. So it's people we're talking about. We get stuck on the money. Look at the assets and the workforce that we have and realign them in a much more relational way. We'll get much more out of them that way. And that's where, if you look at what's happening in some of the Scotland islands, and Argyll and Bute and, you know, Shetland, for example, they're beginning to have a much stronger place-based approach to thinking about their health and care delivery. That, I think, is where the magic happens.
And Donald, I saw you nodding. Is it?
Anne's completely right. I had a conversation this week with colleagues who work in extremely remote parts of the Highlands and Islands. And in fact, I'm going up to Inverness and I'm going to spend some time in the Highlands next week. And the struggles to deliver basic health and social care are really, really hard. And the number one struggle is workforce. And sadly, since the change to practice and the end of the social care visa at the end of July, that's become a nightmare in the last 3 weeks. But Anne's right. We had something called the self-directed support legislation in Scotland, which was all about enabling people to have control over their budgets to the extent that they wanted. And that was a really pioneering piece of legislation in 2013, which was based in Queensland in Australia. And it's not really worked. If we're really being honest, it's not really worked. But it had a tremendous principle, which was if you give people control over how they spend the money allocated to them to enable them to be supported as they want, where they want, then in the end of the day, you save a heck of a lot of money and people are much more, they're much more fulfilled, not least in that sense of control. And we've not done that. And that's because there has been power interests to keep hold of the budgets. And I love that. People are not budging on their budgets because that's exactly what's happening. And that statement I made earlier about we know that we need to transfer the balance of care from hospital to community, from acute setting to family setting. But we've not allowed the money to follow. And as the old saying, if you want to know what matters, follow the money. And, you know, people like Emma spend their lives doing that, and we're not seeing that transfer. So yes, in the Western Isles and Shetland, we're beginning to see, of necessity, people saying, these divides between health, social care, local authority, housing, they're nonsense. We're all the same people. We're delivering the same services to our neighbours. Let's start thinking locally. And indeed, I think Anne will know, as well as I do, huge lessons to learn from parts of New Zealand in that regard. But we need people to have the courage and political freedom to try to do something different, because what we're doing at the moment ain't working.
And Emma, can we budge these budgets? Is it something that we can do? Because that, I mean, I think it speaks to your point about, you know, taking care of people's health needs. Some of that money needs to come with them to support that.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're not from Scotland, you might not have heard about some of the. We talk really well in Scotland, basically, about how we are joined up and how we are able to. We talk about the concept of prevention quite a lot, so that the money goes where it needs to go. It's not just about you don't want to just be spending money on people once they get to a crisis point. You want the money to be spent upstream so you don't get to that crisis point. So we talk a really good game on that. And actually there has been a new strategy that came out in June, which is a public service reform strategy, which is trying to think about how services can be redesigned and how we can change the mindset for budgets, which are very siloed for different services, different parts of government. And I'm usually quite cynical about government strategies, but this one actually did grapple with the issue around culture. And not only is it, you know, I think what you said about it is just the workforce that, you know, that's the asset that we have for health and social care services. But it's also the people. It's also people that are making the decisions and are holding on to budgets and are sort of getting in the way of some of the things we are talking about. And I think we really need to understand culturally why that is the case. And it's taking a step back from, you know, what is it that people are scared of, you know. And I think a lot of it comes down to, if you are in an integration, I've forgotten what they're called, the integration boards in a local area, you've got someone from the health and someone from the social care side. They are responsible for their staff, and they want to do the best by their staff, and they want to ensure that, you know, the money's there for the services, for, you know, to keep people in their jobs and give certainty. And change is a really hard thing for for people to do, and when you feel responsible as well for a workforce. You know, I think there are so many elements of how people respond to these kinds of situations and these calls for change. It does require political bravery. I think it has to come from the top, and I think there is not a lot of political bravery often at the Scottish Government level in doing things differently, because Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers like to be in control of what's happening in their area. But it's also about, you know, well, how does this feel for people further out from that system, and what are people trying to hold on to? And a lot of it is around, you know, fear of you know, of what it means personally for them and for their teams. So yeah, I think there's a lot to try and understand before we can actually work out how to make changes.
But if we want to get care right, then politicians have to trickle that down. They need to be saying these things and meaning these things so that we actually get that change and people are less fearful, perhaps, that it will be detrimental to them, because we know it will be such an advantage to the patient or the client at the end of the day.
Just very quickly on one area of change we've looked at in the social care space was the closure of long-stay hospitals for people with learning disabilities in the 90s and early 2000s. And it's incredible that it was actually not that long ago that this happened. But there was, both in Scotland and in England, there was a big process of shutting these long-stay hospitals, which were, you know, not the type of place anybody should be living their life, and moving people into the community. And actually, it was a period, like, not everything worked well, and there's a lot of issues that weren't resolved at the time, particularly around proper integration into local areas and into work and things like that. But the long-stay hospitals did close, and people did move into the community to a large extent. And how that was achieved, it was an agreement that needed to happen, but there was also double funding, as far as I understand it. There was the continuation of funding for the, and that was within the health area, I think, the long-stay hospitals, as well as funding to get people into the community. So too often when it comes to change, and I think this was a lot of the cynicism with the National Care Service, you assume in this day and age it's about saving money. And actually, as hard as it is, sometimes we need to spend more money to get the change and to get people to move along with it, in order for that long-term, there might be long-term savings, but a long-term, a better outcome for people.
Yeah. Do you want to come back in?
Just, you know, this is really sad that I'm remembering this from experience, because I was involved in the hospital closure programme in the west of Scotland, and particularly the closure of Lennox Castle Hospital, which needed to close 40 years before. But as Emma said, there was no shortage of resource. The Change Fund, it was called, and it was a massive amount of money commitment from the government at the time to enable people to live as independently as possible, to purchase property, and the third sector was working very closely. We probably need the same level of change funding to enable us to move the whole system, not least in aged care. But at the moment, so for instance, in my world, which is both home care but residential care, we know that the way in which people are supported today in larger residential care units are not appropriate increasingly for what people want. They want small group living. They want to live in very similar accommodation to people who exited the hospitals in the 90s and 2000, in the 80s and 90s. But there's no resource out there to physically provide, never mind the availability of property, that aspiration for creating the next generation of how we support people. At the moment, we're modelling ourselves around models which were okay in the 70s but are no longer acceptable now.
Yeah, no, helpful. I'm going to bring Anne in on this point and then maybe take another question, if that's okay. Just watching time.
Just to sort of close that loop there, one of the missing factors in this whole debate, I don't just mean today, but in general, is housing. We don't really bring housing into the conversation as a solution, assisted living and assistive technologies enough, because as Donald was saying there, the solutions are not building more care homes, because that's not what the next generation want. And when I had a short period on the board of one of the national housing social landlords, my eyes were opened to a lot of funding streams that, as in health care policy, I wasn't aware of. And I don't think we're exploiting the potential to be looking at other streams of income generation for investment in social care if we were doing it in collaboration with our housing partners. And then the workforce for health and care need access to affordable housing. So why are we not taking forward our vision for social care in the future? Absolutely, hand in glove with our housing policy and providers.
No, thank you, helpful. We can come back to it. Just this gentleman here in the blue jacket.
Hey, hello. Yes, I've worked for the last 15 years in charitable funding, and we funded wonderful charities working in this area, and really welcomed when this integration approach, which was the health and social care partnerships, came along. We thought, this is wonderful. We'll see the third sector at the table with the NHS, with local authorities. And it's been anything but a partnership. It's been anything but integrated, and it's been anything but joint. It's been horrible, because really what we've seen is power at play, and seeing the power of the NHS, the power of local authorities to effectively outsource cuts and redundancies into the third sector. And yet the third sector, in many ways, what we see lots of innovative upstream work being done there, preventative. It would be the things that would really make a difference. And it's very personal, because they're often able to walk with the person through their life and through the situation that they're facing. And my question to the panel is, where is the third sector in this? Why is it not being brought forward and really promoted in terms of the great work that it's able to do in this sphere?
I'm just going to go down the panel and ask them. Donald, I wonder if you could start.
My organisation represents independent sector. That includes charitable, not-for-profit and voluntary, as well as small private. And I think our bugbear, together with others, has been the way in which integrated joint boards and HSCPs has excluded anybody other than statutory partners. And it's heartbreaking. And the then Cabinet Secretary, Jean Freeman, in 2018 asked 7 of us, chaired by the then Chief Executive of the NHS, Paul Gray, and Sally, who was the Chief Executive of COSLA, to look at how we could improve integration. We came up with 26 recommendations. One of them has been acted upon since. Now, okay, 2018-19, we were then followed by the COVID pandemic. We know why integration has not worked. We don't need another review system report. We know precisely. We took 6 months to analyse, and at the heart of it had one word: power. The inability to give up the power, whether that was financial power, decision-making, autonomy, whatever. And that was as much the fault of the health boards as it was the fault of local government. And integrated joint boards were never destined to succeed without that primary issue of culture being addressed. And if we're moving forward, we're going to have to sort that out, because we can't continue. We'll never answer that question about valuing social care until we value the whole system. And we, as Anne said, challenge the false divide between health and social care.
Everything that Donald said. Also, probably on a personal level, I had the privilege of being part of what was called the Joint Improvement Team, which sat bridged between national government and local government, jointly badged with COSLA, and was made up of people who had professional experience in different sectors, including third sector, including housing, including social care. And we did a lot of work with Donald's organisation around some of the early work to make sure that there was a voice of third sector and independent sector within the emerging integration authorities. The legislation was enacted in 2014. The shadow year was 2015. The team was concluded in 2016. Job done, apparently. Really? So my message is that we absolutely need to resource change with support for adoption and implementation, and not support for adoption the way health does it or the way social care does it, but genuinely joined up support for adoption that really has a focus on cultures, learning and leadership. And I don't think we've got a consistent, concerted approach to that in Scotland. I think we absolutely need to do that because, yes, Carol's right, it is top down. The national government, our political leaders need to set the tone and take their brave pills. But it also needs to be organic and bottom up. And that's where learning together, interprofessional learning and cross-sectoral education and training and opportunities to walk a bit in each other's shoes, that's, again, the magic ingredient of what's going to actually make change happen.
Thank you. Emma, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of points. I mean, I think from my understanding and work with those in the third sector providers on this, the really sort of the big elephant in the room really is procurement and how procurement is done, and so many calls for that to be revisited. And I think, well, I'm not quite sure where we are now actually, but there was some movement for that within some of the plans around the National Care Service. I think that's one of the things that for third sector providers and also for the independent sector, to actually to be some movements in the right direction from the perspective of providers, I think is necessary to sort of reset and rebalance the relationships there and to build some trust again. And then the next thing I'd say, just in terms of what independent and third sector, what the offer is, it is much more broader than just the traditional social care provision, and actually what housing associations can offer as well. In some of the work we do on learning disabilities, it's actually organisations that help people get into paid employment. It's probably one of the most transformational things for people, which also falls under the umbrella that we're talking about today. And one thing we're not very good at is helping third sector organisations really understand the impact of what they're doing and be able to demonstrate that really well. And that's some of the work I've been trying to focus on recently. I'm also on the board of Inspiring Scotland, which is a charity that works with a lot of third sector providers to help, to help them do what they do basically, and actually really be able to make the best use of evidence of impact is really critical. And to be able to tell that story, particularly around that prevention piece, because I think so much of what third sector providers are doing meets the aims of what the government's rhetoric, I suppose, around prevention, but we're just not always very good at telling that story in a rigorous, robust and credible way. So that's some of the work we'd like to do to bring some of the, it's not all economists have lots of tools within this space that can sort of bring that to the fore, and that's something we're really keen to do so that we can shout a bit louder about some of the more innovative and holistic approaches that are out there.
Did you have a thought, Anne? I can see you flickering away.
Just really, thank you, Emma, for that. And I'm conscious that I think all three of us have been, very authentically critical of the current scenario and the current status. However, there are shoots of real hope and an amazing leadership from both local authority and NHS leaders whose behaviours are very different. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with an NHS chief executive who came to visit our hospice, first recently into post, so coming to meet what is, you know, an important resource for the population in the health board area that she works. And her language was, we need to move away from this commissioning services towards, you are a really valued, important partner for us to support the population that we serve together. You know, she gets it. Other similar people across Scotland get it. How do we support and network and empower further these leaders of change? It's not all gloom and doom. There are some real assets and strengths that we can build on.
Yeah, that's key. I don't know if you've got anything else to add. Would you say you've seen the shoots of green shoots? And
I think that's a great illustration, because there are so many good green shoots of hope out there, particularly, as I was saying, in the third sector that I've seen. And yet somehow they get bypassed, they're overlooked. I think they're looked down upon a lot of the time by the professionals, and that's a shame. And I think that we're missing a great opportunity in being able to shift that dial, because otherwise it's business as usual, and that isn't really what we need in terms of social care. I think the other aspect which is really important around the third sector is the volunteering. And it comes back to Donald's point about community and about society and about embedding people back into that. And I think that's really important, because we've professionalised social care. And I think there's room for discussion about how do we actually, as a society, start to care for each other, and start to care not just for our families but for our neighbours. And that has really disappeared, I think, a lot from our society as we've rushed towards that kind of commercial, transactional approach where government will provide. And I think maybe we're coming up against that sort of, we're going to hit that buffer where government can't provide. And so, therefore, what are going to be the alternatives to that?
I think that last point is really important, and it might sound strange for somebody who represents a professional sector, and the professionalism of the social care workforce is really critical, and we might go on in the time that's left to talk about the workforce a bit more, because we haven't. But I think what we're seeing in the place-based approaches in the islands in particular is a recognition that this is not an either-or, that if you can't get a professional qualified worker to come and care and support up the glen in which takes you half an hour to get from the main road to the person's house, then that community has to be supported to do what is necessary to model good care. And we had models like that. Beliskin in the Black Isle is a good example. But we allow those flowers to start to grow, and we don't give the infrastructure of support to allow them and enable them to flourish and thrive. And that's what's so disappointing. So, like Anne, I come across some brilliant examples, not least at the moment in the space of technology and care, which is allowing people, the use of home-based technology, allowing people to live more independent for longer in their own home. And, you know, I was chatting to one of those brilliant examples in Baillieston in the East End of Glasgow just yesterday, an award-winning community-based project which is using technology and care technologists. So they don't have a carer per se, they have a care technologist who helps the person to use technology to keep them independent for longer. So there's examples, really great examples, and in some ways Scotland's leading the nations in these. But we don't talk about them, we don't celebrate them, and they survive for 4 or 5 years and then they die of the disease which is projectitis. We fund new projects, we're rubbish at sustaining them because we all like the new glossy new project, whereas what we should have done was continue funding what was working without looking for the new and to use Emma's word, the sexy.
No, and your point about caring about our neighbours and caring about care is so important. I'm just going to move on, just because obviously we are limited by time, because I know there's a lady over in the back there in the white and blue.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
That's working, brilliant. Jennifer Wallace, I normally talk about framing, but somebody already took that question. So while you were talking, I was reflecting on an event in here 2 days ago talking about local government. And while you've all diagnosed cultural issues, you hinted at some structural issues, but perhaps we could bring those out a little bit more, because you talked, Anne, about towns, you're talking about island communities, but actually in that session 2 days ago, we talked about the lack of community democracy. When we talk about local government in other European countries, their wards are maybe 2,000 people, our wards are 10,000 people. So the spaces and places where social care really is valued at that very local level don't have any organising structure. And I would be really interested in your reflections on whether that lack of very local space to come together is part of the issue here in terms of pushing decision making to where people can really make change. Thank you.
Do you want to go on? Yeah.
Great question, and you're right, it is part of it's a barrier, the lack of it is a barrier, and when you tackle it, it's undoubtedly an enabler. If you look at the European municipality approach, it is a kind of hyper-local, bottom-up model. I'm not entirely convinced it needs to be a structural infrastructure. It could equally be, if you look at Flanders, they've really taken that third sector investment to a level where they've actually invested in mobilising caring neighbourhoods, a bit like our compassionate Inverclyde model, where it's a social movement of ordinary people helping ordinary people. So there is definitely a hyper-local bottom-up approach. Community-led support, the National Development Team for Inclusion is very much on this page, where a light touch infrastructure to sort of unleash, mobilise those amazing community resources, and to just start different conversations with the community, so that instead of jumping to service solutions, you start with, well, what can you do? What can others around you do? And then begin to sort of identify what the gaps are. I think you touched on a bigger issue around, do we look at unified services for some areas of Scotland that make sense? And I know the islands are looking at this in great detail at the moment, and I don't think there's a consistent view on that. Whatever we agree structurally around change, and I suspect there's no great appetite for structural reform, we absolutely need to do much wider horizontal integration. Integration of health and social care, I think, has been a success. I don't think we've gone far enough. I think where we really need to go is much greater horizontal integration with our community planning partners. And I think the smaller partnerships in Scotland that are doing that are beginning to reap the benefits.
Yeah, that's interesting. Donald, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I should declare an interest in that. I'm currently the chair of the National Development Team for Inclusion, which is a UK body, not-for-profit body, which is established to create community solutions for challenging issues, not least of which is how we commission care and support in the local community. And their models around Cornwall, Wales, North England and some parts of Scotland have been very successful. So I think we need to see the solution to some of these challenging problems, not just service solutions, but much more communitarian and dynamic. And that's working in partnership with providers in the third and the independent sector and the statutory sector. I struggle. My organisation represents the majority of Scotland's care homes and the majority of older people's home care. They don't talk to each other. And when I suggest that we all get together, actually, it's as if I've said something horrendous. But but I'm working on it. Your bigger challenge is how democratic is local democracy. And I have recently come in contact with some of the work that's been done in Taiwan, where using platforms, and I wrote about this a few weeks ago, and I cannot for the life of me remember the platform, but I'll remember when I go out the door. It was created because there needed to be a decision for the Taiwanese government on a particularly thorny issue about 4 or 5 years ago. They've now got to a stage at which any consultation engagement at local community level is enabled by this digital platform. But the trick of the platform is that it brings together consensus. So it's not about getting opinion, but it's about creating collaboration so that people are beginning to identify at local community, and it's less than 1,000 people, how we want to respond to a particular challenge. I think there's, and in a piece I wrote a couple of years ago, I think we need to revolutionise local democracy in Scotland, because the way in which we're doing it is detaching further and further away from people. And I say that as somebody who served in a community council and at local level, and who's never, apart from a few aberrations, lived in anything bigger than a village or a big town. That's the majority of people in our communities. Even when I lived in Partick in the West End of Glasgow, I lived in a village. We just didn't tell the rest of Glasgow.
Emma, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for there to be a consensus on this, and I'm in two minds, because actually there are people who within a community will be excluded, and that's how society works sometimes. And so there need to be, in a way, having a higher kind of service delivery or whatever it is, means that it's not just what your neighbours are. Some people don't want their neighbours to know what's going on with them. We have to consider those things. But I think we do need something to shift thinking and shift the dial. And bearing in mind, I totally agree that Project Titus is a terrible thing, and we're always looking for the next new shiny thing. But there does need to be a shift somewhere. And I was struck by something you said over there about, basically about, I think what you're saying there's a limit to what government can do because there's a limit to what government's resources are. But that in itself is a choice that governments make in terms of how much money they raise. But if we are to think about increasing taxation, general taxation to pay for a bigger state offer or whatever it is, then we're going to get a lot of pushback there, because we know that we've lost a lot of trust with the state. We're all quite cynical about it. Even those of us who actually think paying tax is a good thing and are happy to do it also, know there's a lot of waste and want to know that there's good value for money there. So perhaps thinking about, okay, well, if we're going to make a change, if we are going to think about how we fund that, maybe it does need to be a different model. And say if the money was staying within your community, and you felt as a citizen that you could see what that money was doing, say put an increase onto national insurance or something like that, that was predicated on what is needed at a more local level. That might be housing, that might be transport. That might be transport, yeah. Particularly you think about rural areas with very, very different needs. Or it might be working with a third sector partner to come in and deliver services in people's homes. It could be setting up a social enterprise and a cafe, so people can, have some employment that fits with them. So perhaps there is something that we need to be a bit brave and read the room a bit in terms of if we were to put a levy onto general taxation to pay for social care, be huge resistance to it, because actually probably wouldn't trust that the system as it is would deliver that. So if we're going to think about how to raise taxes, maybe we need to think about a different model of how we deliver and that structural argument could come in there. But yeah, I'm not so fully thought through, but I think it's an interesting idea.
And did you get a conclusion at the previous meeting, or was it just a similar kind of discussion?
So they were, that panel were very much in favour of much more local power, and local democracy. So they would, they would create, proper democratically accountable, community councils as opposed to what we have here. And quite a lot of what they were talking about was putting the money directly in the hands of those organisations. But I hear what Emma's saying about the risks of that, because we like to think that, people will always make the right decisions, but history tells us that we do often exclude people who aren't like us. And in this situation where we're talking about people who have additional needs, they could be excluded from that process quite easily. So I hear the tensions on both sides there. Thank you.
So thank you. I think Donald's going to say a few words.
To follow up in that tension, I think, it doesn't cost the same to deliver the same quality of care in every part of Scotland. It is much more expensive to deliver care and support of a good quality in Stornoway than it is in Straven and Lanarkshire. I've long argued that particularly in the Highlands and Islands and island communities, we need the equivalent of a London waiting. We need a fiscal incentive, both for staff, not least in terms of the lack of social housing, but also the sheer expense. I mean, my family comes from Skye. I spent a lot of my early childhood in Skye and still have family there. It is horrendously expensive to live, not least as the rest of the world has discovered Skye's the place you go with your caravan and your caravanette at the moment. It's an extremely expensive community if you're Indigenous in that community to live, and delivering care and support is almost 3 times, not quite, almost 3 times as expensive there than it is in central Scotland. So the risk of some place-based models which aren't granulated is that we don't take account of both those factors and the factors that you indicated in terms of particular groups of people who traditionally have been marginalised because those who shout the loudest got the most. Yeah. But it can be done if it's granulated.
Yeah. I'm just very, very conscious of the time, and if people don't mind, I do want to ask a question about workforce, because it is not only really important that we get that right, but it is probably one of the most discussed things within the sort of Parliament here, and often within the Health and Social Care Committee. So I wonder just even some general thoughts about what do we need to do, what things work well, where are we getting it wrong, if people don't mind. I don't know, Anne, could I start with you, because you look deep in thought?
Yeah. I'm going to leave the visa and immigration issues for Donald. I'm maybe just going to start with regards to the workforce that we actually have at the moment, as well as the pipeline that are coming through our colleges and higher educations. I think we need to invest in learning and leadership development to be somebody who works in new ways, who's comfortable in working in partnership, who is interested in understanding other professional cultures. We will never all have the same culture. We talk about health culture and social care. There's multiple subcultures within each. So I think it's something about investing in headspace and opportunities to learn together, so that we've got a much more creative and open, trusting mindset. And so that's what I would want to see investment in. I don't know.
Donald, go.
Oh God, this is the elephant in the room, because the most important people in social care are those who use care and support, and the second most important people are those who provide them. But frequently they're the same people, because a significant number of people who work in social care are also caring or receiving care in some way or other. We do not reward and recognise those who deliver care and support, full stop. We don't reward and recognise them sufficiently. And that requires a great societal change in attitude. The quote I often use is that today, this afternoon, if you walk your dog in the meadows of Edinburgh for a dog walking firm, you will at least get paid £5 an hour more for doing that task than sitting with somebody in the last moments of their life in a residential care home. Now, I'm not making an equivalence, but I am. So the way we spend our money as a society shows the value we give particular roles. Ironically, with the advent of AI, one of my other interest subjects is that if you look at the top 40 jobs that will go with AI and the top 40 jobs that will maintain, most of those that will be retained post an AI revolution are hands-on jobs. They're, whether you're a brickie, a joiner, or in this context, somebody who cares for somebody, who is engaged in the intimate relational act of care. So hopefully, eventually, society will begin to open its eyes and recognise and reward. We have made strides. In Scotland, with the trade unions and government providers, are fairly close to finalising a concordat for sectoral bargaining, unlike in England, who are waiting for legislation. So we're moving forward, but the big elephant in the room is how do we pay for properly recognising and rewarding the women who do this critical job, who are 275,000 people in number, to say nothing of the thousands of unpaid carers, to go back to the professionalisation point, because they're saving us £8 billion a year by the fact that they're engaged in care and support. And the last thing I'd say, and Anne mentioned immigration because we were talking about it on the way through, we don't have enough people in Scotland to care for ourselves as we grow of any age. Simples, in the words of a well-known advert. There is demographically not enough people. Even if everybody who left school in July and June went into social care, we would still not have enough people. So we have always relied on an international workforce, and that workforce has made us better as communities. But since the end of July the 28th, the mechanism by which those women and men come to our country with their skills and their attributes has been closed by the government. And as a result, we will face in the next few weeks and months a real critical shortage, because unless suddenly we're going to increase salaries from £12.60 an hour to £15, £16, £17, £18 an hour. I've already had, and I said this to somebody yesterday, a manager in tears on the phone with me saying, I know that I can't recruit internationally, but I'm losing staff who are already here, who have been here for 7, 8, 9 years because the new visa requirements introduced by the UK government at the end of July mean that they cannot stay. And that's horrendous. These are people who have been us, and they are us in our communities. And now we're having to say goodbye to them because somebody somewhere has decided they are no longer welcome. So we have a workforce in crisis at the moment, and that crisis is only going to deepen.
Thanks, Donald. And Emma, do you want to?
Yeah, just a thought from, I do a lot of work across different parts of government, and one area I'm often on advisory groups for or whatever is around fair work. And so much of that talk is about how you get private sector employers to pay more, give fairer contracts, you know, and it's like, how do we get the private sector to do this? And my mind sometimes is just like, the social care workforce, you know, you're the employer, you know, I mean, a few layers removed from Scottish Government civil servants, of course, but, you know, the state as an employer for massive proportion of people who are hugely, well, should be hugely valued. And the government and the public sector has this race to the bottom in terms of how much they can get away with paying them. And it's just such a contradiction for me that we, you know, as a government, we are saying, you know, it's so important that people are paid a fair living wage, that they are treated with fairness and dignity and respect, and yet we fail on our own kind of criteria when it comes to social care. And because the Scottish Government can other it into local government, who then say, well, you know, we are under so much financial pressure that we have no choice other than to choose the cheapest contract when it comes to the procurement. And yeah, so I will carry on pointing out that contradiction. But it's strange that it's not, people aren't joining the dots there. And, you know, it's critical for things like we have child poverty targets in Scotland that are predicated on better value, so better pay. We've got, we don't want just social care to be thought about as a safety valve for the NHS, but, you know, that does flow through. You can make savings in the NHS if you've got a better functioning social care sector. And yet, we come back all the time to this best value piece, and it's about people's living standards at the end of the day. So, yeah, I think I don't know why.
There's a word for it, Emma, hypocrisy.
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely.
And I mean, people are nodding. I can see that's probably been the biggest nods, you know, in the audience. And you need to keep pushing the politicians. I include myself in that. You need to keep pushing this and keep saying you're saying this, but you're not doing it. So it's so important. Similarly with the stuff that you were talking about immigration, you know, we need to get those messages back to decision makers, because we need to see are there other ways that we can do this. So, you know, it's really appreciated, this kind of ability to talk about things, because, you know, politicians need to hear, but audiences hear, and then they can go on and think, how do we get these messages back to the politicians, because we've had that chance to discuss them. Is there anybody here? Yep, the lady in the black, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then I think we probably will be tight for time after that.
Can I just make the point that the majority of people who are involved around receipt of social care services are also unpaid carers? And to say we need to shout louder, I'm sorry, those people don't have capacity in their lives to be lobbying politicians. Politicians need to be more aware of what's going on in their communities and the challenges that are facing people without requiring time and commitment associated with lobbying.
Yeah, and your point's very well made. There are a number of organisations who I know support the unpaid carer sector, and they are very, very good at coming to politicians. I think possibly, and the panel really to answer, but if I can just say something, is it is about this delivery of it. It's not about not knowing it.
But I mean, the lady's right. I've had the privilege of knowing many unpaid family carers professionally who have worked for care organisations, and that comment that we're exhausted, we're knackered, we don't have time, we don't have capacity is so true. And yet the system, and I include myself as part of that, we fail to continually remember and learn. So the new National Care Advisory Board that's been set up, National Care Service Advisory Board, it only has one voice present, which is an unpaid carer or a family carer. And most of the IGBs and the health and social care partnerships, unless the third sector rep is an unpaid carer, they're not present. And it's something we need to get so much better about.
Another personal hobby horse of mine is that even when we recognise and support unpaid carers, during the time that they're unpaid carers, we do nothing about supporting them as they emerge from their unpaid caring responsibilities, as happens, often at a point in time where they're exhausted and are not helped back in to their networks, their employment, their participation. And I think unpaid carers' participation in local communities and community wealth building is a loop that we haven't made
I just want to sneak this last question in if I can. Do you have a mic? Yes.
Oh, So I represent the Fair Work Convention, and in 2019 we published a report and recommendations on social care. And although there has been progress, I think just from this last discussion, there's been very little tangible change for workers. And I just support everything that everyone's saying about pay, and just to introduce fair work into this sector, there really needs to be more done to support our workers and to improve the whole sector, to attract people to work in there, and to, I think there's definitely hope, but there's been a long time with very little tangible change for people who work in that sector.
If only we had put the amount of money and bodies of the National Care Service over the last 3 years into the Fair Work Convention's report implementation, I think we'd be in a better place.
And I think, as somebody who sat on and took part in the Fair Work Convention and was present throughout, all of us who sat on that convention were aware of one dominant issue. See, if we were talking about men, we'd be having a different conversation. It's not for nothing that that report challenged the genderised nature of decision-making in Scottish local government and national government, and the fact that 86% of paid carers are female and over 90% of unpaid carers are female. We would not be having the same discussion that report concluded, not least in its forward, if we were talking about men. And I suspect we wouldn't have had the wasted 3 years. So we are trying on the edges to advance the principles of the Fair Work Commission and the Social Care Report. But in the end of the day, it needs a significant realignment. As Emma said, fair work can only happen with fair commissioning.
And a shout out for the Scottish Women's Budget report as well, which is fabulous.
They did a lot of excellent work. I'm just very conscious of the time, and so I just wonder if any of the panellists have just a final few words. Emma, is there anything you would like to add, just in the final few words?
I will add, we did a really great project working with some unpaid carers to value the time, to put a value on unpaid care, which we did with some parents of adults with learning disabilities. And that was a really great project, but we also don't know how many unpaid carers there are in Scotland. So, another thing we don't know. So I think that's what I'd like to end on. We've seen the National Care Service Bill fall, but we've also seen the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill fall as well, or just get abandoned, which did have a lot in there about actually needing to understand data and evidence much better across all of Scotland and across the needs of people that need more support. So I just want to end on that as an economist and an analyst, I think that's so hugely important that we don't lose some of the momentum that's gained by these bills not getting where they needed to be, that in order to value social care, we need to be able to count and measure. You care about what you measure, really, and we haven't put a lot of resource into measuring things, and I think that's partly why we're here today. So that'll be my final shout out.
I suppose I'd just like to say that I'm more hopeful now than I have been probably for the last 5 years. So I know we've got a big hurdle ahead of us, because going into a Scottish election, it's going to be a bumpy ride. But I think data is really important, but so are stories. So we're going to be going into a period where there'll be a lot of local conversations, local doorstep conversations. That's a time where stories can be put across. So I do think there is a better alignment at the moment around some of the policy work than I've seen for some considerable time. And I think there's a window of opportunity to be policy influencer at that very hyper-local level. So let's all use it.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, I suppose having listened to the three of us, you might get very pessimistic about social care. And people ask me, so why would you go and work in social care compared to the NHS or any other area? And my answer is there are few sectors where the ability to build relationship, to maintain contact, to get to know story, to really be part of somebody's life changed as there is in social care, because of that continuity of relationship, that depth that you can reach, and that it is actually the most people sector that it's possible. So yes, we've got challenges, and it's up to some of us on the platform to address them, but there is also an amazing reward to be achieved whilst working in social care provision.
Yeah, and there absolutely is, and getting that message out as well, isn't it? So it just falls for me to do some thank yous. So I'm going to thank the audience first of all, and I wish we always wish we had more time to come back and to discuss, but the questions are really helpful, and it really does allow us to go away and think about them later as well. Thank the panel. I really appreciate your time. It was lovely beforehand as well when we got a chance to speak as well. And of course the staff, thank you very much. And the sounds as well, and people will have noticed we had BSL here, which is really important as well, so thank you to all of them. I've also been asked by the Parliament if you can feedback. I think there is a QR code and you will get a chance to do that, but in general, if you would like to email any of us or email into the Parliament and say how you found this or the Festival of Politics in general, we would really appreciate it. And although this is the last day, there are a couple of sessions left. So if you're not exhausted and you want to hear more about politics, then please, please go to them, because everybody is very, very welcome. And so thank you so much again for coming. And I hope to see you all again or speak to you all again if there's anything we can do to help. OK, thank you.